You know, a common question I get is, John, why do you wear your black gloves in these videos? Well, for a multitude of reasons. Number one, it just looks more presentable on screen compared to my hands that are generally covered up in paint and scratches and from all the other stuff that I do. Another reason is that I don't like really touching the models when they're fully painted and finished with my bare hands. After a while, it can't hurt to finish. And the third reason is because, well, it's been kind of a meme or a tradition, let's just say, on this channel. This time, however, it's for another reason. And that's because this thing is filthy. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today welcoming you to a new episode of Old Tank Repair. On today's episode, the candidate is this vintage 1990s Revell Germany Panzer III Ausf N kit. As we saw from the video intro, this model here has spent a really long time in a state of disrepair and was basically neglected for a really long period of time. This video here is going to be following in this same exact format as the other Old Tank Repair videos that are posted on this channel, where I take you, the viewer, from the project start and bring you along all the way up to the model's completion, where you can see how I brought it up to the condition that we have here. Because of this format, this video here will be longer compared to the other model showcase videos that I have posted on this channel. Because it's longer format, I recommend either watching this video in segments or possibly hitting that little gear on the corner in order to speed it up. This model here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information will be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Regardless, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and kick this video off. And normally at this point in the video, I'd say, and here's the model at the start of the build, and to which I'll go over the kit's description and the history and all that. Well, for this one here, it's going to be slightly different because, unlike those other models, this one here isn't quite at the start of the build, as what we've seen from the pre-video bumper. This model here is a partially started build that was started by someone who was in way over his head, and wisely, probably the smartest idea he had was to set the model aside to a further date and time where someone would have the skills required in order to finish it off and finish it off properly. Now, if you're watching this and you're saying, wow, John, that was pretty harsh. Why would you do that to some other person? Well, because that other person is none other than yours truly. You see, this model here, I purchased back when I was much younger, and I was able to get up to the condition seat here, and then I decided to stop, walk away because I was in way over my head. Rewind, shall we, back to the spring or the early summer of 1999. Back then, a much younger John, before he was known as the EastCoastArmory.com guy, was at his local hobby shop, and while strolling through the really cool armor section they had at the time, stumbled upon this kit here. What is this kit, you ask? Good question. The kit is a 1/35 scale Panzer III Ausf M kit from Revell, Germany. The kit itself was among several other of these Revell Germany kits that they had on stock, from several different unique variants of the Panzer IV to, I believe, even the Stug 3. The model itself looked really enticing on the box. The box art is nicely illustrated, and again, as we all know, I'm a huge sucker for box arts, and that's just as true then as it was today. And again, I just like the way the vehicle was illustrated. The camo pattern was unique. The model's rendering was pretty good, and I figured, you know, this is probably going to be a good kit. And to add to that, on the side of the box here, we had some other examples, which looked pretty good as well. Now, at the time, I was pretty cautious, and wisely so, for just randomly buying 1/35 scale model kits from companies that I didn't really have a good background in, because, well, this is the 1990s time frame we're talking about, and kits back then, like I stated in a few other videos, were heavily using the individual link and length track method, as we all know I utterly despise with a passion. I love saying that in these videos, how much I absolutely hate those damn tracks. Well, when I was buying this kit here with my grandmother's birthday money, no less, again, I was, like 13 years old, give me a break. The model was probably going to have Lincoln length. Wasn't sure, but I figured, you know what? Revell Germany, I've built some models for them in the past. I built the Revell Monogram M48 Patton. I built a few Revell kits. So, you know, under the box here, it should be something with possibly vinyl tracks. Well, as soon as I paid my money and I got to the car and my dad was driving us home, I took a Swiss Army knife in the glove compartment, popped open the seal, to which then I was completely and utterly donkey punched. Because what this kit is here is, well, this kit, along with all the other Revell Germany kits of the same era, is not anything of their own individual tooling. 100% that is. Instead, what you're getting are reboxed versions of Dragon kits from that era. And as we all know, 1990s Dragon kits, you're going to end up with, you guessed it, individual Lincoln length tracks. So I got completely donkey punched on this one. Wasn't really happy about it. So Alex was a bit pissed off to think about it at the time. But unfortunately, all sales are final. And I decided, you know what? I've tried the Lincoln length tracks before. And maybe I'll be able to find some kind of replacement tracks of some sort or another. Don't know. But I'll find out. I'll get to that bridge when I get to it. I got the model home. At some point, I decided to start the build, to which then the model was assembled to the state you see it here. And I was able to build the model basically, looks like apparently 3/4 of the way to completion. The model itself is a pretty simplistic kit. It's just a, you know, standard Dragon plastic model kit of the era. It goes together pretty well, and the kit's also very nicely detailed, you know, I'll give them that. However, then I got towards the end of the build where it was time to start adding the paint and then take it from there to completion. And this is where things started falling apart on me. You see, at this point here, I was really trying to learn how to paint models via an airbrush. And I was playing around with different airbrushes, namely my father's, he had a single action Poshy airbrush at the time. And I was trying to figure out how to use it. And it was just a complete and utter disaster. In addition to trying to figure out how to use the airbrush, at the time, my dad was playing around with using the latex paint as opposed to constantly buying bottles of Tamiya paint just in order as a way to save money. And, well, if anyone watched several of my other videos, you'll know that when you're using exterior latex house paints to paint plastic models, you can't just use the paints directly. You have to go ahead and add some kind of a primer to the surface, or else the paints are just not going to work well. And I ran into that problem, but on top of that, I just ran into a whole litany of problems with diluting the paint, getting it nice and thin. It was too thin, and it was fingering, too thick, too clunky, and the model was just a disaster. At some point in the build, I believe I dropped the model at some point, and I broke the rear idler mount right over here. And at that point, I just got so disgusted, and at the point, I didn't have any sort of replacement track options. I wasn't going to go ahead and use individual link because we've seen in my other videos how well that turned out. So I said, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to go ahead, put the model in the corner like this, set it aside to a doomed corner, blacked out corner in the shop. I'll deal with it at some point in time. Hopefully one day I'll be able to get to it. And the model literally sat in that spot since 1999. Fast forward to 2020, I'm cleaning out the shop, and lo and behold, I stumbled back into my old disaster, and I figured, you know what? I've already done a few of these rebuild videos, and I'm pretty comfortable now, and also I have more knowledge now in tracking down replacement aftermarket tracks. I think and there's really no reason for this model to be in this condition. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and grab him and finish him off the way I wanted to all those years ago. And here's the model now, right here in front of you. So we're going to go over the model's contents as much as I possibly can, starting with, of course, the start of the show, the main Panzer III. Now here we have the model. Note you could probably see on screen the sheer level of clunky dust that is on the surface. This is about 20 years of dust. Sawdust, resin dust, probably metal fragments, paint fumes, what have you, all sitting there on the surface in this lovely little blanket of failure. Just stare it at me. The build itself, like I said before, I was able to assemble about 75% of the build, and it seems to be in decent shape. There are some broken pieces I have to contend with, like namely some parts on the shirtsen, which broken off. Some pieces are bent, but everything, again, seems to be mostly intact, and I should be able to piece it back together and scratch build what I'm not, or what able to replace, really. Here you can see the lower portion, not too bad. Apparently I was smart enough to mount a metal rod that connects the two sprocket halves together, as you can see. Taking the turret off. This turret does not have any locks on it. It's just a simple a friction fit where you have a nice tight ring and just sticks in place. May or may not be changing that, but we'll see. Here we have the interior. There you can see the metal rod going across the opposite side to the other sprocket. This is a technique, by the way, that I still utilize today on contemporary builds. So this model here is glued together with Tester's red tube model glue, as this was the adhesive of choice I was using of the era, which means don't be surprised if a lot of these parts are going to fall apart on me during the rebuild process. In fact, I look forward to it because I'm going to be giving this model a thorough bath and trying to wash away as much of this crap as possible, during which time don't be surprised when parts fall off. Again, it's a good thing, it'll fall off in a nice controlled manner, then I'll be able to clean them up and reinstall them with more permanent glues. Some of the surface details are on, but like right here, this little hook. This was a staple of my builds, and by the way, this is a trademark which you'll see on a lot of beginner builds, specifically kits built by youngsters. When I talk about in my videos, skill level recommendation, I'm like, yeah, this build here is best left for someone with an intermediate to advanced range. This is the type of stuff I'm talking about because, I didn't really use tweezers. I said, screw it, I could use my fingers, they're nice and small at the time. And, the piece wasn't exactly installed properly. So this is something that is easily addressed. Luckily, I can just pop it off, clean it off, and remount it properly. The wheels on this model here are just held on with Elmer's glue. This was something that I did at the time on these Dragon builds. I really liked Tamiya models with the rubber polycaps because I could spin them on the axle, and I figured the Elmer's glue will do a similar trick where it holds them on securely, but I can still thoroughly paint the pieces while rotating them. This I'm probably going to revise. Either wheel looks to be in decent shape. Gotta clean that up a little bit. The biggest concern, of course, was the broken section here of the rear idler mount, but luckily, with the way the kit is designed, you have extras, so fortunately I will just be able to repair that. Some underhull detailing. You can see the paint was just not working out for me. Now, because of this, this model here is going to be basically treated like some of those other rebuilds that I've done on other videos I've posted in the past, where the paint itself is going to be thoroughly stripped off. Luckily, this is exterior latex, so the denatured alcohol batch should be more than enough for taking care of the surface, bringing it back to bare plastic for me to then pick up where I left off. Picking up the turret, you can see here, the turret looks like it's in pretty decent shape overall. Parts are all properly assembled. I'm not seeing anything broken or askew. Handle here has got some damage to it, but that's more or less from it clunking around. It's hard to see really with all this dust on it, so once the dust is washed off, I'll probably get a better view. But right now, I'm not seeing any surprises. The smoke grenade launchers are on in a pretty clean way. These ones here probably could be fixed a little bit. They're a little bit wonky, but I believe that may or may not be just the way the kit's designed. And I was going with the short-barreled version for this kit. Alright, well, with the basic model out of the way, this now takes us to the contents, or I should say the grab bag of parts in here. Now, I'm not going to lie, there's going to be parts in here from not just this kit, but probably a bunch of other just things that are tossed into this box over the years, which is, by the way, pretty common when you find them all in this condition. So here we have the Shirtsen. Now, I believe this may be some of the parts that were Revell Germany specific. I'm not sure if Dragon kits actually supplied you with the parts like this. What's unique is that the Shirtsen's actually made from a clear, plastic, thin material. It's kind of like that material that you find on the cover of blister packs, but really, really cheap ones, almost like cookie packages. It's that same type of plastic. But they used it for the Shirtsen. More than likely, this was done to make sure that the panels are to scale thickness, One problem when you're going with injection molded plastic for parts, specifically thin parts like this, is you can't really mold super thin parts with this medium. And so that's why on many plastic model kits, what they do is the parts in the center are thick and then they taper towards the ends, giving you the illusion that the parts are nice and thin. And that was pretty much standard for many, many years, and even still today in many respects. This one here, they went with some kind of a stamped material so that it's nice and thin, and it's to scale, so you don't have to worry about that scale thickness or the taper on some of the edges. And again, these just are going to get cleaned off and then repainted in a more appropriate manner for the paints that I'm using. And thinking down further, you'll see that this is a Dragon kit. So much so that I'm pretty sure maybe some of the runners might have the lizard still on them, but this is 100% Dragon tooling, Dragon plastic. Only you'll notice that the little lizard on the tab here was replaced with the Revell logo. It's just literally a little plate with the Revell logo sitting right over where the little dragon icon would be. But if anyone has ever worked on Dragon kits, you'll notice that the quality is of Dragon, and also the quality of plastic is that same grayish plastic that was used by Dragon of this era. So here we have the turret shirts in. These pieces here, still left on the runner, because I just paint them on the runner, then I free them off later on. But here goes that taper I was talking about. See what I mean? Thicker in the middle, then it tapers on the edges to give you the illusion of the thinness. And there's some other clips. Again, I'll probably more likely sort through this as the build progresses. Rebuild progresses, more like it. And here goes the runner. If anyone's ever built a Dragon Panzer III, you'll know what I'm talking about. Wait a second, hang on. Give me one moment. And we're back, and not just in my back, but I also have here for comparison a real Dragon runner from a vintage Dragon Panzer III pattern of vehicle, and you'll see, oh boy, look at that, it is the same exact runner. Ta-da! Here's the Dragon. There's the lizard right there in the corner. Then, whoop, there we go. There's the Revell Germany one. Obviously, it's the same tooling. And just like with all Dragon kits, even though you'll have plenty of parts to build a model, there always seems to be tons of spare parts on hand. And this kit's really no different, and should actually come to some help on this build, because chances are there may be one or two some small details that are missing on the build that have been lost over time, and I should be able to piece them together with some of the spare parts that are left here on the runner. Digging further, more bits and pieces. Right here we have the two Bosch headlight housings, or front housing I should say. If we recall on the build, or if anyone noticed, they are not mounted. So there we go. I should have all the parts required to flesh those out. There's the long barrel variant, but it's not going to be used on this build. And let's see what we got here. Some tools, bin lid, extra bin lid for good measure, no tech light, jack block, base, and of course some fender flaps, all the fixings you need for the vehicle in question. Some more fender stuff, the grills that are molded solid. I think I may have used some mesh work on that, but I'll be able to find out as the video progresses. And this part here, this runner is actually worth its weight in gold for this build, even though it's as dusty as it is, because this runner here contains the spare parts required for the idler mount in order to repair the broken piece that we have here. So the kit does of course supply you with enough parts to assemble it, but again, during the course of the construction, the part fell or broke or teleported to Lost Partia, and I was feeling really, really bad at the time, but as it turns out, we have some spares. So this runner here is going to be invaluable for this build. Further, we have some more runner parts. Again, this is probably for the rear idler, but these ones were eventually fitted to the vehicle. And that's it for that. The rest of the box contains a smattering of stuff from Tamiya meshwork, from various builds. I don't know how the hell they wound up in here. Another final drive, more mesh, some Chinese quality control thing from some other model kit. A bunch of them, probably from trumpeter kits. Piece of plastic, a bunch of the free cements that are glued, that are supplied with models that are totally useless. Runner, some 1/35 scale figures. This guy here is, I think, a Navy SEAL, Dragon Navy SEAL specifically, from an old diorama from eons ago. Pretty cool MP5s. Oh, this is cool. A little knockoff Micro Machines F-15 Eagle. You can tell it's a Micro Machines because the little tab over here with the wheels would be, this flips down on the real Micro Machines, because I used to play with those as a kid, but don't ask me how this wound up in here. Anyway, okay, so back to the more relevant features. You'll notice that the model is missing a bunch of road wheels, and I was able to dig through the shop and find basically all of the road wheels to put the model back together. Here they are in this bag, but I believe I am short one wheel. So luckily the kit gives you some spares, of course, and with this in hand I should be able to piece the tank back together, getting it back to full configuration. There might be some issue with the hubcap, but again, I'll discuss more about that as the video goes on. We have some string here from tow cables, and this is great, a string here from a pastry box. Fantastic. All right, this here is another super important piece, and it's actually one that I was lucky to find, because obviously it's the rear idler, and these rear idlers are pretty specific for the Panzer III and aren't exactly something that you get a lot of spares of. So I may have had one or two spares in my spare bins, but having the originals on hand just saves a whole lot of time and having to dig for them. So that's a win. I'm going to put it in this bag here. Perfect. So with the idlers in hand, this should make the rebuild technically very simplistic in its overall necessity, as horrible as it looks with the condition that it's in right now. All right, digging on through. More junk, garbage. I don't know what that is, but oh, this is good. A 1/35 scale Dragon VVSS Sherman rear idler wheel with the crappy track still glued onto it. Yeah, that's probably from another project for a future video. Oh, this is good. We have here the decal sheet, water slide decals. Quality looks to be actually okay, despite the condition that the remainder of the stuff is in. I don't exactly see any filth on these decals. That's pretty interesting. So we'll see, of course, as the build progresses, how these decals hold up. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, John, so where are the tracks? Well, those things were hawked off on eBay eons ago. There's no way in hell I'm keeping those, or would I use them on this build? So, of course, a replacement had to have been sourced. Well, luckily, since I built this model, eBay is a thing, and it's a fantastic place to acquire said replacement parts. And we have here what I'm going to use. Right here is a bag of DS-styrene Panzer III track. These tracks here were acquired again off of eBay and are from one of Dragon's more recent releases, because Dragon in recent years realized themselves how much Lincoln Link tracks suck, so they too saw the light, at times I should say, and went with a single piece flexible option. These tracks here, since they are made from modern tooling, are going to have their detailings on them, both on the interior sides. If you notice, you can see the hinge detailing. You got the little holes for the mud slits, as well as the mud slits found on the guide horns, as well as their exterior detailing is fully molded and present as well. Because these tracks are Dragon and the tank is Dragon tooling, there should be no doubt that these tracks will be able to time and fit perfectly with the old school Dragon tooling that we have on this kit here. Well, now that I got all the parts back in the box, this fella here is probably ready for me to take it to the shop and proceed from here. But one thing you'll notice that is missing, and it's actually a pretty crucial thing, is the instruction sheet. You'll notice that no instructions are present with the model right now. Now, obviously, this wasn't the case. Originally, the model did have a set of instructions, but over the years, the instructions probably got lost, misplaced, and they're pretty much gone. I've looked in the shop everywhere where this kit was stored, as well as the possible locations where it would be, and sadly it has yet to turn up. So from this point here, I'm going to be rolling pretty much blind on this one, but fortunately I have plenty of other Panzer IIIs, Dragon Panzer IIIs no less, in the stash where I can basically just reverse engineer it so I can get it where it needs to be. And again, luckily the model is pretty much complete, so it's just going to be figuring out where the tools go as well as maybe a few other odds and ends. So armed with all those manuals on hand, I should be able to basically cobble this thing together and get it across the finish line finally after all these years. In order to do the rebuild, the very first step is going to be obviously cleaning off the model's surface. That felt blanket type layer of dust on it is not helping anybody, and I really need to get rid of it in order to make heads or tails of what details need to be replaced as well as repaired. When it comes to dust-wise, this is similar to that M4A3 E8 rebuild that I've done a couple videos back, and that one actually got a pre-wash with a soapy solution in order to dislodge the dust, but also I needed to loosen up some of the plastic parts because they really needed to have been just replaced and removed outright. This one here, it's kind of in that middle area where I need to obviously remove the dust off the surface, but by and large, the model is built okay. Most of the components are assembled pretty much properly, so I'm not going to have to really worry too much about removing the components in order to replace or repair them as much as compared to that Sherman. So this one here at the moment, I'm just going to do just a simple wash of the dust. Now, of course, this may be subject to change, and of course, we're going to see this as the video turns on. But for now, what I'm going to do is for the model itself, for the turret in the hull, I'm just going to give it some squirts of Windex, which will dislodge the dusty surface, and I'm going to run it under the faucet over here on this bathtub in order to just wash away the remnants. The runners themselves are going to get a similar treatment. I'm just going to squirt them again with the Windex and just wash off. That should be plenty enough to get off the majority of the dusty blanket that we have here. One thing I want to point out before I do that though is I do want to close off the drain just to prevent any sort of details which may pop off of the model. And if that happens, they're not going to swirl down the drain and off to, Las Pardia. So to prevent that, I'm just going to go ahead and seal this guy off. All right. With the drain in what I presume is the closed position, I could go ahead now and start with the cleansing. First, pop off the turret. With the Windex in hand, just squirt away. You can see how the Windex is somewhat pressurized because it's being squirted out of the bottle, and it is just blasting the surfaces away. And already you can see that the vehicle is much cleaner than it was before, but there is still a fine layer of dust on it. And it's that really nasty stuff that really just doesn't come off. So, otherwise, if you have your nicely built and painted models on display, it would behoove you to get yourself a nice airproof plastic case for them, because this stuff, once it starts building up, you're not getting it off. So, just a few more squirts here or there. Let this Windex set in. Set this fella aside, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the turret now. Real quick, this is the runoff from the hull. So, needless to say, it looks like this stuff is doing its job, and you really don't want this junk on your models. So, use that as a cautionary tale. Okay, so the turret is basically all set. I'm going to do the same thing to the runners now. I'm going to just wash them off. Now to do this, I'm going to use the faucet with a little bit of warm tap water, and I'm just going to give all of the surfaces just a brief once over. I'm not going to go ahead and thoroughly scrub anything at this time. This is just to wash off the Windex and any other dislodged dust that's on the surface off at this point. Of course, the next step is where the model's thoroughly going to be completely stripped and brought back down to bare plastic, but we'll touch upon that in a moment. During the rinsing, I found it easier just to take the runners and just swirl them around the tub at this point here. Of course, the drain is closed, so none of the parts are going to wash away. And it also, from washing the whole turret, the tub did fill up with water. So might as well just use this. Just swirl the runners in this type of format like you see here. And that should have the same effect as the running faucet did. So, of course, once the model is all done, I want to make sure that no parts popped off during the rinsing procedure. So just do a quick scan of the tub. Everything seems to be where it needs to be. No parts are running around loose. So at this point here, I just open up the drain, let all this drain out, and we could take the model and bring it back into the shop for the next step. And with that felt blanket now removed, the model is already looking much better. And from here, we can take it to the next step, which will be to remove the base coat. Now, having said that, I'm pretty sure that a number of my viewers and subscribers out there are scratching their heads wondering, well, why? The tank actually looks like it's in pretty decent shape. You can just throw in the wheels, give it the camouflage and the markings, throw the side skirts on and, call it a day. Well, unfortunately, looks are a bit deceiving because although from this camera distance here, the tank looks like it's, ready for the next step, realistically, that's not really the case. Like I stated earlier, when I first built this model, one of the aspects of this build that I botched was the paint finish. At the time, I didn't know how to properly use an airbrush with the proper PSI, nor did I even know how to properly thin and mix the paint. And because of that, there's a lot of evidence of that found on this paint finish. Some areas on this finish, you'll see chunks of foreign particulate just stuck to the model surface, like right here on the turret. Hopefully that gets in focus. There you go. These are probably just some sort of dirt and debris. When I was airbrushing, it got stuck to the wet surface, and I just said, screw it. And over here, you could see some of the thickness of the paint in the leading edge. This is a symptom of improperly thinned out paint, or paint that was improperly applied as I put too many layers on too soon. And these type of attributes are found all over this finish in a multitude of places. So because of that, the best remedy is for this one to be completely stripped down back to bare plastic in order for me to rebuild a pond wedge. Now to do that, I'm going to be utilizing the denatured alcohol like I've already mentioned. The paint is either Tamiya or I believe it's actually just exterior latex like I may have mentioned earlier. And both of these materials, denatured alcohol will easily just eat up without, of course, harming a single inch of the model's polystyrene surface. That is important and it's a must. For the wheels here, I'm actually just going to throw them on the inside just to prevent them from running around loose inside the alcohol bath and I have to track them down. I really don't want to stick my hands into that stuff. So just use the hull as basically a carrying vessel. Now, when it comes to the denatured alcohol baths, I've seen some tutorials out there, but the one method that I prefer is to weigh the model down and submerge it fully so that the denatured alcohol has access to all over the vehicle for it to do its thing. If the model is only part way in the alcohol bath, obviously the paint is not going to be as degraded on the top extremities as they are on the parts that are under the water. It's kind of obvious. And this is important to point out because plastic models tend to float whenever they're placed in some kind of a bath solution, either a soapy water bath or even a denatured alcohol bath. So I always found it best to add some mass to the model in order to weigh it down, just to keep it on the bottom of the tub so that the stuff can run its course. To do this, I have here a little cupful of just random metal objects just for mass. Some bolts, some brass turnings from my lathe, and even, yes, some shell casings. Why not? All of which will easily keep this fella where he needs to be. From here, I'm going to go ahead and pop the turret back on. Hopefully the turret stays on. Sometimes they float on their own, but we'll see how this one works out. This one doesn't have any locks on it like it does, like many other tank models do, so it's going to be interesting to see if the turret stays on or not once it goes into the solution. For the runners themselves, this is a bit interesting because I've never strip paint off of full intact runners before, because, you know, usually when I do rebuilds, the model is completely finished, you know, or was finished at some point. This one here, since it's, you know, technically it was never finished, you know, I got these components here. These parts here should fit into the bucket that I have the denatured alcohol in, and since it's only these portions that are relevant to get paint stripped, it shouldn't be a problem. Same thing applies to some of the other parts, and these guys here I definitely also want to strip down as well, for obvious reasons. So, let me go ahead, readjust the camera, get the tub center and screen. Let's go ahead and get this guy swimming. And of course, center stage, here we have the tub of denatured alcohol. This is the same tub and solution that I've used on the other rebuilds in the past, and you can even see evidence of those rebuilds with the sludge found on the bottom. And I don't think you're going to see it in screen, but it seems like the bottom has like a ripple to the sludge, kind of like when you see sand at the beach, but that's interesting to point out. All right, not really relevant, but interesting nonetheless. Well, from here, this Panzer III is going to become a U-boat, and we're going to go ahead and dump it in 3, 2, 1. All right, the air is bleeding out, and you're going to start seeing it sink to the bottom. There we go. The tank is on the bottom, turret is not flying off, which is great. So now I'm just going to add the other parts. Now, of course, at this point here, I just want to point out some safety. Denatured alcohol is not something you really want to mess around with. If you notice, I'm wearing gloves for this. I don't really like to get this stuff on my skin. The stuff does have some vapors to it, so you don't want to really breathe it in. Wear a respirator. And, of course, wear safety glasses. You don't want to get this crap splash into your eyes. It's not fun. Alright, so, and needless to say, don't drink it. Of course, definitely don't do that. That would be bad. This is not the type of stuff that you get high on. This is just the stuff that will mess you up. So, you don't want to do that. Okay. Dump these runners in here. This runner's not really relevant. Well, you know what? I'll do this one with a second round. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the lid on this bucket, set it to the side of the shop where no one's going to accidentally trip on it, and when I mean someone, I mean me. So let me go ahead, get that taken care of, and we'll cut to the next scene where the denatured alcohol has already run its course. So I think it was in here for long enough. Let's see how the paint is dissolving. I'll start with the turd shirts in here. It's coming off, but not really that much. I think this one needs to be in the solution for a little bit longer. Keep in mind, this one I added, of course, about 15 or 20 minutes after the main parts were thrown in. So this one, we'll put a pin in it for the time being. This one I threw in originally. Let's see how this one does. Yeah, much better. Much better. There we go. With just a few passes with this stiff bristle brush here, the paint easily just washed right off. And judging by the way the material is washing off, apparently my memory is exactly where it needs to be, because this is indeed exterior latex paint. So, and it's just coming off with extreme ease. Granted that the stuff has been in the solution for a good amount of time. Here you can see the clear components now back to their original configuration. These are a bit on the thin side, so when it comes to the stripping, I'm actually being very careful. I'm using my fingers here to support the weight of the force that's being applied to them with the paintbrush. And there we have it. Little speck over there. Alright, this one's all set. Let's just move along until I get to the meat and potatoes of the vehicle itself. I got pretty much most of the hull stripped away. Still a few little stragglers here in between these little nooks and crannies. I was able to do the job, but it was hell on the model. A lot of the parts were broken off, namely for the shirts, in which I was kind of expecting. You know, whenever you strip paint off these models, I generally say this in these videos, it is not necessarily one that won't go through without any damage. So it's pretty normal to see this type of damage occur. Now, luckily I have, hopefully at this point of the build, the components that cracked off. If there are any that I lose throughout the duration of the build, or possibly even if there's a piece or two that I just don't see right now, these will have to be fabricated. Luckily, the shirts and guards are relatively easy to do out of pieces of aluminum, so as the build progresses, we'll see how that turns out. But so far, I think this one here is pretty much done for now. So yeah, that's basically it. I think from here, I could get this fella washed off, and whatever paint's left on the surface, I don't think is going to cause any problems. So let me go ahead and get this guy set aside, and then I'll be able to work on the wheels. But I'll get back to you guys after all of the stripping is done on the remainder of the parts. And here's the model now going through its rebuilding process. A lot of the mistakes that I originally made to this model when I first built it have been corrected, and I've also been repairing a large number of the details that broke off during the paint stripping procedure. Let me go ahead and bring the camera in closer so I could go over in more depth what exactly needs to have been repaired, as well as in many cases replaced on this build. Starting with the tank's turret, you can see that a lot of progress has already been made to this equipment that we have here. The most notable addition that has been made, or I should say added, are the addition of the shirts and panels. Now, like I mentioned before, the shirts and support struts themselves received a bit of a beating during the paint stripping process, and a good number of them were either just broken off or even had some compound breaks in them. Luckily, I was able to track all of the broken parts down and get them fully repaired to the way they were before the paint stripping process even occurred. Once everything was reassembled, I went ahead and then mounted on the shirts and panels in the way that you see it here. And by the way, I must add, it was a bit surreal to me personally to finally clipping these pieces off of their runners that they've been on for so long, and to the point where in many cases the runners were completely empty and allowed me to finally discard them. So to me personally, that's a bit of a win. However, I did run into a slight fitting issue with the shirts on this build. Now, I can't comment on if this is a indication of what the way the kit is designed, or if this was just a mistake that I personally made when I built this model all those years ago. Like I said before, sadly, I don't have the original instruction sheet for this kit, so I can't really iron out specifically where the fitting went wrong on this one, but needless to say, I did have to come up with some creative solutions on how to finalize and complete the set that we have here. You see, the two shirts and sections on the sides went on relatively easily. However, the one on the back was less so. With the way the shirts and struts are on either side, they're supposed to lock into these two little cutouts found in the rear panel that we have here. Unfortunately, when the piece was fitted to the vehicle, it just did not clip on in the appropriate manner. As you can see, the struts are off by about an eighth of an inch or so on either side. The piece, by the way, is assembled properly because on the piece originally there was this little section molded in where the shirts and rear would line up with the rear bustle. And this too added some problems. It just didn't fit on right, and it was just a real mess of trying to get it to fit with the kit manner. So what I went ahead and did was that little alignment point was amputated straight off with a Dremel and some sandpaper. And I went ahead and plugged up those two sections over here where the clips are supposed to snap into. Those were also deleted with a little bit of red putty bodywork. Once that was completed, the shirts just fit directly in place to the way you see it here. Now, unfortunately, this has a negative effect on the little extension that connects this portion to this portion, which on the real vehicle I believe would be hinged in order so that the crew hatches here can be opened. To illustrate this, here I have the original kit supply component on the original runner. And if I try to put it on the side, you'll see that it just doesn't fit. The gap is far too wide on both the right and left side of the vehicle. So, regrettably, the kit supply component is not going to be salvageable and used on this build. So, I had to figure out what I was going to do to fix this, and the solution that I came up was pretty simple. Luckily, this component here is not really that complicated, so I was able to fabricate 2 new doors out of strips of styrene that will bridge the 2 gaps that we have here. Now, these are right and left hand specific, so let's see if these fit on. And there we go. As you can see, these fit on pretty good and are a good fit for the original kit ones. This is also true for the one on the opposite side. And as fate turns out, I didn't have to look too far to find the thin styrene that I have here, because it was actually in the box of junk that I have that the model kit was resting in. The styrene itself is nice and thin. This is a thinner gauge than I typically use on many of the other builds you've seen on this channel. And it's actually a gauge I don't really purchase much, or if any at all. So again, it's just a happy accident that I had some in the box. What's nice is that the pieces in many respects are kind of better than the kit ones. If we look at the back end, you'll notice that the kit does this little diamond type cut where it's thicker in the center, then it tapers off on the ends to give you that nice little thin edge, for reasons like I mentioned before. Well, on the styrene one, that's not the case, because it's just, you know, thin plastic sheet, so it's got a constant thickness throughout. And when I line up the pieces, as you can see, they blend pretty well with the thicknesses found on the edges of the kit supply parts. While on this location, this takes us to the actual side hatches themselves. I had an error with the hatches when I built the kit. You see, I actually mounted these on upside down. So this little visor here, the slit was on the top as opposed on the bottom, which means I mounted the pieces as a mirror image. And this is just not accurate. So I actually had to pop the hatches off in order to replace them. One of the hatches did pop off with minimum amount of damage, but the one on this side here was a complete loss. The piece was totally destroyed. Now, normally this would be basically a dead end and a game over situation, but luckily, with the way the kit is designed, there are plenty of spares that are supplied with the kit. So I was very fortunate in that respect. The hatches were both removed. The areas where they were glued on were cleaned up thoroughly. And then once all the remnants of the old hatches were gone, I was just able to drop the new hatches directly in place without any problems. The little gutters here were also able to be salvaged, which was a good measure because these are not supplied as extras on this kit, and keeping them original was a good benefit. On a similar note, the handles you'll see here have been replaced with metal ones. One of the handles was lost during the paint stripping process, but the other one still remained. So rather than just drilling one out, I had to do it to both. And if anyone wants to know why, it's just for continuity. Although I could have left the original one in its place, it would still look a little bit different compared to the new one that I would have fabricated. So rather than going with that approach, it's best to just cauterize them both and just replace them both with the same amount, or I should say the same thickness of wire. It just leads for one less thing to stand out. Moving down further takes to the air filter. This is the original one that was seen on the build earlier. One ding that I saw on it was a sink mark right there in the center. Now, I don't recall if this was found on the original kit's tooling or if this was a side effect of the glue that I was using when I built this model. The Tesser's red tube glue, the way it works is that it's a toluene-based solution and it actually melts plastic, and then once the stuff dries up, the plastic then hardens, ergo leaving the two pieces glued together. Well, on this one here, I believe I went a little overbearing with the glue, and it got so soft to the point that it actually started deforming the top portion that we have here. Now, luckily, the indentation wasn't really severe, so in order to repair it, I just took a little swipe of red putty, filled in the gap, and then just polished it down with the sandpaper, leaving for the surface that we have here. You'll also see some sanding marks in this section. This was to remove a small little glue fingerprint that was on the surface here from, again, when I built it when I was a youngster. Once that was polished away, the piece was then good to go. The turret itself is mostly done now. There is that little clasp mechanism that I believe is present for, that holds the hatches in the open position. I gotta see if I have any on hand, because I don't believe I have any spares, or if there was even one originally on this model. A little hazy on that. I gotta double check with some pictures on the internet. The smoke grenade launchers, they need their firing cables added. This one here, they do have a little hook that's mounted in sandwiches between the turret and the smoke grenade launcher. This one has the piece present, this one doesn't. And I believe this one here, if I'm not mistaken, might be in the wrong location. So I have to double check to see if that needs to be altered. So that's really all the work that needs to be made to the turret, I guess. At that point here, the turret's basically good to go. Oh, one other thing I did is I added a drop of white glue on the inside portion of the barrel trunnion to stiffen it up a little bit. As you can see now, it really takes a little bit of effort in order to elevate or depress, which is a good thing. It was a little bit on the looser end before, and it was a bit floppy, so this addressed that problem. Moving to the hull, this now takes us to really where the majority of the revisions and repairs needed to have been made. You'll notice quickly that the front mud flap has been remounted. Of course, this popped off earlier during the paint stripping process. And you can see that the side skirt rails have also been repaired and remounted to the model. The pieces themselves were, again, just a complete wreck after the paint stripping process. And some places the pieces were broken in several locations, but fortunately I was able to piece them together back to the way it was originally. On the front portions right here and here, you'll notice that I actually had to add a small bit of styrene strip in order to replace a chunk of plastic that was broken on both of these sections. Luckily, I had some plastic strip on hand that was the same width and thickness of the original Dragon tooling, so having the piece then bridged the components together is one that can be done in a relatively seamless affair. There is a slight bit of seam work that's found on both these locations. Once the super glue dries further, I can go ahead and polish them down with some sandpaper, which, once the unit is fully painted and weathered, should blend in pretty nicely. Of course, the biggest thing that was repaired was the rear idler mount system. Here you can see the unit now mounted. And while on this point here, I want to mention that I too had another mistake on this build where I had this unit mounted upside down, and this was something that I definitely needed to have addressed. So I went ahead and I was able to pop off the other section, clean them up, and then mount it in its appropriate location. For the one that was missing, luckily, like I mentioned before, the kit does supply you with a set of extras, so I was able to just reassemble the component from the spares given, and then once they were done, they were mounted directly to the model. On the back here, there was some seam work to contend with on the exhaust manifold. That was simply just polished away with some sandpaper. Takes us to the antenna trough. Now this unit here popped off during the paint stripping process, but it popped off in a clean manner, so it was relatively easy to get it back to the model. However, one thing I want to point out is that on this support leg that we have here, note I had to add a piece of strip styrene to act as a spacer in order for the piece to fit on properly. Without that little piece there, the unit was just not really working for me. It was teetering on one side or the other, and if I tried to just secure it on in place, it would have a bend in the middle. So by adding the little foot that we have there, it makes the piece now line on in its appropriate way. Don't ask me how that's the case, but I'm just showing you guys what happened. The antenna base was fitted to the vehicle. I snipped off the original antenna mount, or I should say there was a little stub that we have here, and I drilled it out with a small pin vise, or I should say a pin vise with a small Dremel bit, so that I could mount on a piece of thin floor wire, as I usually do on these builds. You'll definitely see that towards the end of this video. Moving along, you can see that I went ahead and popped off that little lift hook that we have on this section here, along with the other one. They were on, but they were mounted improperly. They were just not sitting flush on the deck properly. So I went ahead and plucked them off. I'm cleaning them up now. I may, if one survives to a good enough extent, I may make a quick mold of it so I can add them to other locations that I believe they're missing on this model. So that remains to be seen. On the exhaust, or I should say the air intake vent that we have here, it originally has this guard, and I still have the guard, but I needed to pop it off so I could go ahead and clean up some of this area. I had this hook glued onto this section, which I believe is inaccurate from the pictures of the real units I've been studying. And I believe I'm also missing a hook on this side here. So if I'm right and there is no hook mounted on this section, I'm going to mount it where it needs to go. If that's not the case, it's a good thing because I can make a mold of that one too, and I'll be able to cast rest and replacements to outfit them on any other locations where they might be missing on this build. So again, that's something else that remains to be seen. While on this section here, you can see though that the air vent, like I mentioned before, I added a little piece of fiberglass mesh to this section to give you that little bit of grill detailing found on here. And it's actually something that's a bit ahead of its time. This is something I would do today, but nowadays I'd probably use either a piece of photo etch or I'd make my own out of a piece of thin photo etch mesh. But regardless to say, young John knew had a good idea on what he was doing back then in terms of that type of detailing. Once I progress from here, the original vent cover is going to be added, sealing it off, and then it'll be like this one we have here where you will still see the mesh present, but it's going to be underneath the detailing. Currently on the hull, I'm at the moment where I'm going to be replacing the broken headlight. I have the component, it's in my parts bag, and I have all the parts to finish it off, but this is a really snag-prone location. I want to get to this at the very tail end, right before the model goes into paint. So I'll have more information on that, again, towards the end of the video. On the side here, one modification that I'm doing is, you'll notice that this model here has a lot of other indentations molded into these sections for undoubtedly other variants of the Panzer III family, since this hull is a recycled piece that's used for several, renditions of the Panzer III from both Dragon and, in this case, from Revell. These pieces here are going to be noticeable, so I'm going to go ahead and polish them away with some sandpaper. It's going to be a little tricky with the return rollers fitted, but if I get in there with a small enough tool, I should be able to do the job. This is something that needs to be done to both sides of the model as well. Also, you can see here that I've been already polishing away the indentation where that side hatch goes, which is present on more earlier examples of the Panzer III. On this side tin work, I'm currently going through the process of amputating out the clips that I had originally glued on to support the shirts in. And if anyone's wondering, well, yeah, you need to have those clips present, but the ones on the model here were thoroughly broken and trashed. So rather than trying to piece them together, it's best for me to replace them entirely with scratchable ones made from thin strips of aluminum. So more information on that, of course, is to come. This obviously needs to be done to both sides of the vehicle. One more thing to mention on this side, you'll see that there's a small little cutout in this area over here. This is something that should not be there, so I'm more likely going to be trying to repair that with a smear of a little bit of putty, and then hopefully I could just sand it to the point where it looks indistinguishable from the remainder of the vehicle. On this side here, you can also see some of those mounts that I need to polish away, like I mentioned before. And this takes us now to the final drive. And one thing I want to point out is that you can see that I went ahead and modified the kit ones so that I could have a rod running through to support the weight of the sprockets. This is, again, something that I do on current builds, and it's something I frequently mention in these videos. This one here is just in a more cruder format. You'll notice that when I sanded this down, I did it in an angle, but you know what? It was able to hold the sprocket on quite well. I did drill this section out here and done it in a little bit of a crude manner. And this side here, I want to point out, it looks like I made a mistake when I drilled it, and I accidentally drilled the holes too large. And it appears that I used some kind of a pre-existing spare part of one flavor or another. It's obviously plastic, and I glued it to the final drive to act as a bushing in order for it to have the correct reduced size of hole. Although it's still a little bit larger than the one on the opposite side, but you know what? You couldn't notice it once the sprockets were installed, because with the way they lock on, that wider hole doesn't really do a whole lot. So it works, and it's something I'm honest, there's no point changing, but it's just something I want to point out because this is something that I still run into today on many other builds, and it's something that I do talk about. So, well, I thought this day would never come. This model here is now fully repaired, and at this point can head off into paint. Starting with the lift ring that we have here, you'll notice that this one here is a new replacement edition. The kit was short of these pieces from when I first built the model originally. However, I was able to pop off one of the other units that were on the rear plate here of the hull, and I was able to clean it up, removing any sort of glue residue that was caked on the bottom portion of the surface. Once I had this unit cleaned up, I went ahead and made a mold of it, so I was able to cast any replacement lift hooks like this one here for not just this build, but in case I ever run into a situation like this again. The replacement piece drops right in where the original one would have been placed, and once everything is painted and weathered, we'll just blend in with the remainder of the detailing. Aside from this lift hook, we have another lift hook right here on the ventilator. like I mentioned before, originally I would have had them mounted on this side plate here. However, I went ahead and looked up some pictures of a Panzer III kit from, I believe, TACOM or Meng. It's one of the newer kits that are on the market. Anyways, I found a good picture that showed the lift point actually mounted on the air intake, so I went ahead and adjusted it from the kit. The original ones were just too far gone to salvage, but luckily with the way the kit is designed, I had 2 extra units found on a extra runner, so I was able to remove them off and just simply mount them in the locations where they were seen on the other build. A similar thing was also seen with the fire extinguisher over here. The original fire extinguisher, I believe, mounts horizontally, judging by some of the mounting locations that I see here molded into the top fender, but with the side skirts mounted, I saw on that other vehicle that I was mentioning that the fire extinguisher was mounted in this section over here, so I just simply adapted it and mounted it in this location. I did have to slightly modify the part because there was a section that emerged from the back portion here of the fire extinguisher, and this would not have been able to fit in this portion. The fire extinguisher on the kit resembles more of a early pattern of fire extinguisher. If anyone knows the German early war tanks, you'll probably have a good idea what I'm talking about. They look very similar to the later one, but there's just an extra section here on the end. So for this one here, I just simply cut that piece off, and for all accounts, it now blends in like it would with the standard later production Tetra pattern of fire extinguisher. Moving along takes us to the side skirt shirts and mounts. These units here obviously were all fabricated out of sections of thin aluminum. The original ones just were not holding up and actually were mostly all missing on this build, so a new set was going to be fabricated. Luckily, where the original ones were mounted, the glue marks and in some cases remnants of the original clips were present, so I was able to basically just piece it together on where the new replacement ones are going to be fitted. The new replacement units were added to both sides of the model. One of the surviving examples was removed because it would not have matched the continuity of the replacement pieces. But with that replacement one, or I should say with that original one, I was able to find the size and shape of these pieces so I could fabricate the new replacement unit. So it didn't exactly die in vain. I actually readjusted the tubular convoy light. When I originally mounted it, it was really close to the side hull here, and from what I've seen on pictures online, it's supposed to be more towards this portion of the fender work. Simple modification, I just simply carefully pop the glue bead and then just relocate the part to where it needs to be. Moving towards the sides of the model brings us back to those sections that I mentioned before where there were those outlines for the various details that get mounted to the other versions of the Panzer III that recycle this lower hull. Because they weren't necessary for this build, like I said before, they needed to have been removed, and here you can see the final outcome with the way they were polished off. Once everything gets painted and weathered, it'll look like that the hull is completely seamless without any of those remnants remaining. Finally, on the front hull here, the only thing to point out was the addition of the little power cable that emerges from the Bosch light, and this was added to both sides. In order to add this with a pin vise, I drilled 2 small holes here on the top deck, and then just added the piece of floor wire to the location that you see here. Moving our way to the turret, and some of the final modifications that I made involve the smoke grenade launchers that we have here on the sides. Originally, there was a little lift point that we would have mounted on this section here, and the point of this lift hook is it sandwiches the grenade launchers to the side of the turret. Well, on the model here, it would have been a separate piece that you have to carefully glue on, and of course, this is something that I did botch when I first built the model. One of the units I was able to install, but the second one, not so much. Well, obviously I need this bit of detailing in order to finish this model, so luckily, since I had the other one left on hand, I was able to carefully remove it from the smoke grenade launcher, clean up the unit from any glue shards that were on it, and I was able to make a mold with it along with the other lift point that I mentioned before. Once I had the mold on hand, I was able to cast the new replacement units, and unfortunately the original piece flung off to lost party, so fortunately I was able, since I have a mold now, I can cast as many of these units as I need, and the new units have been mounted. Along with the new lift point, you could also see the power, or I should say the firing cables, and these two have been added to the smoke grenade launchers. This is also the same type of detailing that are typically seen on my other builds. These pieces here are fabricated out of thin pieces of floor wire, and then the top holes were just drilled into the surface with a pin vise, and this does do a great job with completing the look of the model. Outside of that, the other details to mention are the two hatch stops, or I should say the hatch locks that we have right here on either side of the turret. These units, one of them was originally found on this build, but unfortunately did not survive the painting, or I should say the paint stripping process, so that part now was lost to the sands of time. In order to replace this, I just simply went ahead and fabricated two new ones. I fabricated them out of a piece of thin sheet styrene, and I also drilled a small little hole in the center of them and added a pin in order to give that little stem detailing that is found on the real piece as well as on the kit components as well. Once these new pieces have been fitted, they will just blend in with the remainder of the detail as the model progresses past this point. The last thing to mention before the model goes into paint are the road wheels. Now, some of the components were in better shape than others. Starting with the idlers, like I showcased before, they had some excessive glue marks found on the spokes with the way the units were assembled, and you can see that they have been cleaned off and now look much more presentable than the way they did before. Outside of the idlers, the road wheels themselves were in pretty decent shape overall. They did have some clunky Elmer's glue found on the inner backings here because of how I originally mounted them to the model, and these glued sections were all completely removed. A good chunk of them were washed away during the paint stripping process in the denatured alcohol, and the remainder that was left was just chipped away with a needle file and a pin vise, I believe. Once the glue was removed, I also went ahead and cleaned up any of the little holes that are found here on the road wheels themselves, if they had any obstructions from either glue or any other type of debris. So that's all gone. However, like I stated before, one game over aspect that I would have had on this build if I was building it, several decades ago, was that I was missing a road wheel. However, that of course wasn't going to be a problem with this build because since the late 1990s, one thing that I did learn how to do was to cast components in resin as well as making molds. The molds came in handy to help the lift rings that I mentioned before, but they also came in handy in order to replace the missing road wheel. Here I have the mold in question right here, and by the way, yes, this is the same mold that has the road wheel parts as well as the lift ring parts, which are located on these two sections. But anyway, luckily I was able to make a good quality mold from the original wheel, so the new replacement parts match perfectly. For this build, you notice that I have two replacement wheels. That's because when I was in the process of popping open one of the original wheels, it flung off on me and one of the halves was bounced somewhere in the shop. Don't know where it went to Lost Party, so, yeah, that one is forever lost. But I was able to take another wheel and make the mold out of that, so I was able to create the missing road wheel with the new resin components. And here you can see the two parts here that were made out of resin compared to the other units, and of course they should look absolutely identical because again they're made from the same tooling. The only difference that I made for this one here was in order to make a mold of it, I had to modify the original Dragon tooling, where on the Dragon piece you have a stem integrally molded to the one wheel. Well, when I was trying to pry the pieces open, the stem basically just cracked and wasn't able to be salvaged, so I polished down the stem and just made two flat discs in the mold. So because of this, when the pieces were casted, I was going to have to replicate that stem section that would have originally been molded in. The stem that you see on this unit here is fabricated from a piece of bar resin stock that I turn on the lathe to the appropriate width, and then I also drill them out so that the centers are nice and even. The centers and the disc itself basically mimic perfectly the original kit supply tooling, so once the units were fully assembled, they have the exact same specs as the original wheel that we have here. And that's not just true for these two row wheels, but it's also true for one of the other row wheels on this table, which was used to make the Master. And to my credit, I can't seem to guess which one it is, because, well, it blends in absolutely perfectly with the remainder of the set. Now, because I was able to fabricate the two missing row wheels, that means the other wheels that I was going to originally utilize for the main set can be kept, but they can be used just for the spare wheels, which are mounted on the vehicle's tinwork. So, at the end of the day, the vehicle is going to be able to be fully equipped with all of its accessories. And here's the model now going through its painting procedure, and at this point here, it's getting its base coat applied. One thing that is generally agreed on is you have to add some kind of a coat of primer to the model surface, or else the paint just won't stick that well. And this is true for basically everything from Tamiya to Model Master to, like I say, I use exterior latex. I've never used any of the Vallejos or any of the MIG pigments, but I'm pretty sure they're very similar. Also, one technique that I'm not really a fan of is the technique where you just have the bare plastic and you just edge it with the airbrush with some flat black, and then you add some shades over it to get the desired look. I really don't like that approach. I hate the idea of having bare plastic being exposed. It's just not something that I really appreciate. So, for my builds, I go with the all primer method, which again is a technique that is very frequently done by many other builders. Now, for the type of primers, this is where I differ from most people. Some people use dedicated model paint primers, which are, they're fine, they do the job. Me, I'm going to build a little bit more on the archaic end. Rather than going with that approach, I just use El Cheapo Rattle Can Flat Black Spray Paint for like 98 cents that I got at Home Depot. The flat black spray paint goes on really easily. The paint is extremely cheap, and when you build as much volume as I do, it adds up after a while. And the paint adheres perfectly to the polystyrene surface, or sometimes even resin surface, depending on the models that I'm working on, and it holds on very, very well. As you can see, it's a nice even coat of paint that was applied. And this here gives a phenomenal base for the paint to stick to. Now, for the paint, like I said before, I'm utilizing exterior latex paint that I have custom mixed to the colors that I like. And of course, this being a German tank, here's my shade of Dunkelgelb, and this is the same color that I've used on just about every single model tank in my, or I should say German Dunkelgelb colored tank in my video channel series. In order to get the paint to work properly in an airbrush, you do have to dilute it, but since I have the stuff by the gallon form, I basically have an endless amount for me to build my models with. Now, in case anyone's wondering, John, is there an over-the-counter color that is similar to this that I couldn't recommend? The answer is yeah, it's Tamiya dark yellow. In fact, this color here, it basically is just Tamiya dark yellow that I went ahead and made a color swatch of and had it made in gallon form at the Home Depot. So again, it's great if you build a lot of models as I do, and also in the scales that I work in. Once the paint is thoroughly diluted though, it just applies with the airbrush as would any other paint. Here's the turret going through its base coat application. As you can see, it's not fully ready yet. Once the turret fully dries, I'll be able to hit the mantlet here. Generally, it takes 1 to 2 coats max for me to get the desired effect that I'm looking for. And while this here is set aside and drying, I can now focus on the remainder of the parts, namely the vehicle's hull, the running gear, and of course the side skirts, or the shirtsen. And like I said before, it feels really good getting this model now back into paint, because it's funny because we basically now went full circle, because when I first started this build, as we can recall, it was all in its base coat of Dunkelgelb, but it was a cruder application compared to the way you see it here. And it's good to know that over 20-something years, I've basically learned and improved my techniques. So that's saying something. You'll notice that the paint is on in a smooth manner. There are no drips or any other type of impurities, which plagued the first time I painted this build. So again, it's good to know that I've actually progressed in my skills since that point. So now I'm just going to set the turret aside, and I'm just going to power up my air compressor here and apply the remainder of the paint like I said before. For my airbrush, I utilize a Pashi double action airbrush. Does the job, and I have it hooked up to my big air compressor over here. And this is one thing I always like to mention whenever I do talk about painting tutorials. A lot of times you buy these air compressors from places like Hobby Lobby or some modeling forums, or I should say modeling websites, and those air compressors, in my opinion, are just crap. They're just not strong enough. They output max like 2, maybe 3 psi, and generally on my builds, I'm rolling about anywhere between 35 to 40 psi for just a simple base coat, and then I could fine tune it depending on the paint and the thickness that I'm pumping through the airbrush. So I really recommend something no less than 5 gallons for an air compressor, and they can be had for really cheap prices. Honestly, a lot of times the good air compressors cost less than some of the modeling hobby grade ones that you see on those other places. And right now, or specifically when I'm filming this video, it's around the holiday season, it's not uncommon to find a good air compressor for not a whole lot of money. And in case anyone's wondering what it involves to get your airbrush modified to adapt it to work on industrial type air compressor, the only change that you make is actually to the air hose, and that change is simply by adding on this quick connect valve that we have here. With the way the industrial air compressors come, they have this quick connect type fitting on them, and these units here just simply plug directly to them. These units are very affordable. They're about $2 or so, and you can find them in basically any location that sells the air compressor or the air compressor components. Places like Lowe's, Home Depot, Tractor Supply, Ace Hardware, or basically, again, these days, Amazon.com. With this setup here, this now gives your airbrush a lot more capabilities compared to the standard configuration where it's hooked up to those little miniature underpowered overpriced compressors that I just mentioned. And here's the model now fully completed. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. Starting with the model suspension, here you can see what the row wheels look like now fitted to the vehicle. Like I stated earlier, some of the row wheels are the original plastic tooling ones, however, some are resin copies. It's been so long since I built this model that honestly, I don't remember which ones are the original kit ones versus the resin copies, which goes to show you that if you have some really good quality cast resin pieces, they will blend directly into the rest of the model without anyone looking twice. Taking us directly to the sprockets in the track that this model originally would have had, of course, would have been the individual link and length, and of course, that was not going to be utilized. I went ahead and picked up a single-piece set of vinyl Panzer 3 tracks off of eBay. They are DS tracks. They are, of course, from a recent release of the Dragon Panzer 3, and they just made it to this older tooling kit without any sort of problems to be mentioning. First, the tracks themselves are excellent. The DS tracks, if you ever have a kit that has them, are fantastic. They paint and weather without any sort of problems. Of course, for the paint, you don't want to use spray paints, like I typically mention, but this is more so with DS tracks. For this one here, I painted the tracks with Tamiya, I believe either rubber black, NATO black, or flat black. Doesn't matter, either of those three will give you basically the same result, give or take. And then the weathering was done with my typical dry brush method. The tracks super glued together without any problems and then secure onto the tank. Again, it's almost as if it was meant to be. Well, that's partially due to the case that this is Dragon tooling, but it's interesting to see how the modern Dragon components can still fit and time with the older Dragon suspension pieces without any sort of problems. So if you are working on one of these older Dragon kits and utterly despise the individual link and length track because you have a brain and actually have eyes and see how crap those tracks actually are, and if you do encounter a set of single-piece DS tracks on eBay, I recommend picking them up, specifically if you could get them for a really good price. You'll be thanking me in the long run. Of course, if you replace the kit tracks, the sprockets need to be modified as well. With the way the kit is designed, the sprockets are made to be glued directly to the final drives, keeping them permanently in place, which for link and length makes sense. However, for a workable or a single piece track like this one here, it's less than ideal. You see, with the way the tracks need to be mounted, if you try to mount the tracks on after everything's painted and weathered, and if the sprocket's permanently glued on, you're going to have a harder time in getting the sprocket to index with the track without causing paint chips and other scuffs with the track itself. So by having the track installed with the sprocket at the same time, this really simplifies the build and makes installation go by a little bit easier. In order to do this modification, you are going to have a metal rod connecting the two sprockets together, and I believe I did touch upon this earlier on in this video. Of course, with this mod, the sprockets are held on in a really strong manner and are more than durable enough to hold up with the track tension that are exhibited on both track bands. Moving along takes us to the shirts and panels. These are the kit supplied units that were showed in the beginning portion of the video, and here you get to see what they look like mounted on. One thing that I touched upon earlier was the unique choice of material usage found on this kit. With these pieces being made out of that really thin, clear plastic, you really get to see how scale these components look once mounted. Normally, to achieve something like this, you would need sections of photo etch, but you can see with this material here, it basically gives you the exact same result. The units were painted extremely easily. One thing that I did not have to do was add any sort of scuff marks or any type of abrasive texturing to the panels themselves. Because they are made out of clear, smooth plastic, some people might think that this may lead to paint chipping or possibly painting issues, but this was just not something that I ran into. The only thing, or I should say the only prep work that the shirts and panels received was a shot of flat black spray paint. After that, I just went through the standard paintwork as I did on the rest of the model, and there were really nothing else to mention. The panels themselves went on to the model with also surprisingly no issues. This was something I was a little worried about because of the little fender mounts, or I should say the shirts and mounts that I touched upon before. Because they are no longer the kit originals and are new ones that were scratched with a lot of metal, I wasn't really sure if the new scratch built units were going to work in the appropriate way or were going to line up with the way the kit was designed. Well, obviously that wasn't the case. I guess I lucked out on this one, and all of the little clips were in their appropriate locations, which meant that the shirts and panels went on without any sort of problems. It's also interesting that this material I don't think is really used anymore on the newer generation kits from basically any of the companies out there, from Dragon or I believe even Tacom. Dragon, they use their razor edge material now, where basically it has the thick section in the center, but it tapers off to this thin edge that we have here. This does look pretty good, specifically if you build the model out of the box. However, in my opinion, these older kits with these clear plastic panels that are found here are technically superior compared to the newer kits that are on the market. The remainder of the upper hull details went on without any problems, like the Pioneer tools, as well as the spare wheels. Because I did not have the original instructions for this kit, I was going in blind on the actual tool layout. Fortunately, I was able to find some images on a Google search of the new Tacom variant of this kit, which, by the way, fantastic kit in case anyone's wondering. But with those pictures, I was able to basically cobble together the tool layout that we see here. Once I knew which tools go where, they just lined up to their appropriate locations without any headaches whatsoever. While on this section over here, you can see the weathering added to the antenna storage channel. On this model here, I went ahead and replicated to look like chipped and scratched wood, which is the material that this component would have been made of in real life. This is a common mistake I've seen on a lot of fairly decent builds out there, where they mistaken this component from, instead of being made out of wood, of it being made out of metal, and then they weather it the same way they would weather the rest of the tank. This is something that you want to avoid on your models, and it's just an easy thing to look out for. On the antenna base itself, this section, the antenna would not have been utilizing the rubber insulator, which is seen on later production German tanks. On these units here, specifically on the Panzer II and on this variant of the Panzer III, the whole antenna can actually fold up into this channel, but the base itself is not rubber. Rather, it's a collection of leaf springs that basically form a cage set up around the antenna and allow it to flex when it is struck by the turret or any sort of obstruction that the antenna might rub across. Moving rearward takes us to the two taillights, and this is a bit of detailing that is commonly overlooked on many models out there, and it's one that's very easily done. However, it's one that if you misunderstand what they are, you can easily mistake the colors that they get painted in. On this taillight over here, you can see that there are two lenses that are present, and they are painted differently from one another. This is a bit of detailing that's actually pretty tricky to find some resources on. However, from my research, the colors are as follows. The one on the top is a orange color, while the one on the bottom is just gloss red. By just carefully painting these two locations with a paintbrush, you should get the look that you see here. What's nice is that the lenses themselves are appropriately detailed on the Dragon kit, so getting the paint into their appropriate locations should not be very difficult with a fine point paintbrush. On the opposite side, we have the No-Tech, or the tubular convoy light. This is painted in blue as what would be seen on the real German vehicles. Moving upward takes us to the turret. It's nothing really much to point out here that I've already mentioned earlier, but here you can see what it looks like now that it's fully painted. Moving to the paint and the camouflage, the model is painted in a two-tone German camouflage scheme, which is just the green painted over the standard Dunkelgelb. I've seen many renditions of this particular variant of the Panzer III with this type of camouflage scheme, so it fits right into the time frame that this vehicle would represent. Like I mentioned before, the tank's Dunkelgelb base coat is my standard shade that I've utilized on many builds, and the green is to me olive green that was airbrushed into the configuration that you see it here. For the model's weathering, I went with my typical approach, which is a mix of counter shading, washing, as well as dry brushing. For the markings, the kit supply decals were utilized, however, I tweaked them slightly from the original form. You see, because I went with a camouflage pattern that was not on the color palette, I couldn't exactly use those decals that were intended for those other vehicles. Well, technically I could if I could do anything I want, but I decided to possibly save those vehicles for a future build possibly down the road. So for this one here, well, of course the crosses are used. That's, basically standard. However, for the numbers, I went ahead and changed the layout of the numbers slightly, making this vehicle different from the ones that were supplied with the kit. The decals themselves were pretty decent. I didn't really have any problems with them. They didn't crumble or fall apart or anything when they made contact with the warm water, and they applied on without any problems. After the application, the entire model, of course, was sealed with the VMS varnish, giving you the look that we see here. At the end of the day, I couldn't be any more pleased with how this build turned out. This model here was something I had a little bit of guilt over for the longest period of time because, well, as we saw, it's something that I failed to finish during the original build-up, and was something that I just had to stuff into the corner over there, feeling defeated for all of those years, where this thing literally just became a dust farm. And if anyone out there is still watching the video at this point, I want to say thank you and congratulations. I do understand how short people's attention spans can be in this day and age, and if I could keep you entertained for a longer format video like this, well, I must be doing something right, or at least you must have some interest in whatever it is that I'm doing. Well, hopefully after watching this video, you get to learn some new tips and techniques that will help you in your future builds, or possibly you might even have a little bit of motivation now to crack into your stash where you might have a old kit that you partially started squirreled away. Perhaps that kit for one reason or another was never finished and brought over to the finish line, and maybe after watching this video here, it might give you the urge to go ahead and push that one along, getting it completed. And if that does sound like you, one thing I have to tell you about is that if you do go ahead and make the decision to revisit and complete an older build like this one here, the feeling that you get is completely worth it. Obviously, what's left for this model now is for it to be put in a nice little dust-proof box and added on display with the other models in the collection, where, well, it's a tad bit overdue, if I may say so myself. And with that, that wraps up this old tank repair video for this 1/35th scale German Panzer III Alf M kit. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being old tank repair videos like this one here, the other model showcase videos that frequently get posted, as well as also the larger scale project update videos that are another constant upload topic that are posted on this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll catch you guys again on the next one. Later.